The gavel hit the bench like a gunshot. I had barely stepped through the side door of Courtroom 7 when it happened. The sound bounced off the tall walls and settled in my chest like a warning. I stopped walking. Every head in the room swung toward me at once. Judge Carlton Reeves was already leaning forward, eyes hard and jaw tight. He pointed at the worn medical bag hanging from my left hand, the one I had grabbed straight from my clinic that morning without a second thought. "This isn't a hospital," he said coldly. "Put that bag away or leave my courtroom. My name is Dr. Petra Walsh. I have worked in emergency medicine for 11 years. I have stitched wounds in the back of moving trucks, kept men breathing in rooms where the ceiling was falling, and made decisions that no textbook ever prepared me for. Walking away from someone who needs help is not something I know how to do. But I had not come here looking for trouble. I had come because Felix Adamu, a young veteran sitting at the defense table, had called me 2 nights ago with a voice so thin I barely recognized him. He had asked me to come to court. Just to be nearby. Just in case. He hadn't told me why, and I hadn't asked. I just came. So I lowered the bag slowly to my side. "I'm only trying to help," I said as quietly as I could. The judge scoffed like my words had personally insulted him. "Then go do it somewhere that isn't my courtroom." He looked at the bailiff and gave one sharp nod. Before the bailiff could take a single step toward me, Felix swayed. It was subtle at first, just a small tilt to the left, the kind of movement you might miss if you weren't watching carefully. But I was watching. I am always watching. 11 years of emergency medicine train your eyes to catch things other people miss. Then his breathing changed. It became rough and shallow, like he was trying to pull air through a wet cloth. His hand reached for the edge of the table, missed it, and then he went down. His chair scraped backward and his body hit the floor with a sound that made the woman in the front row gasp. Everyone froze. I didn't. I was already moving, cutting across the open floor between us, ignoring the murmurs, ignoring the judge's sharp intake of breath, ignoring everything except the man lying on that cold tile. I dropped to my knees beside him, snapped the bag open, and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. His pulse was rapid and weak. The judge slammed the gavel again. I said this isn't a hospital. But I was already checking Felix's abdomen, pressing gently, reading what his body was telling me through every small response. The color of his face. The sweat forming at his temples. The way he flinched when I touched his lower right side. The defense attorney, Patrick Crane, crouched beside me. "What is it?" he whispered. I kept my voice low and steady. "He's bleeding internally." Patrick's face went pale. He looked at Felix, then back at me, then at the judge, like he was calculating how quickly this could become a disaster. I didn't have time to reassure him. I was already opening the emergency kit inside my bag, working fast but carefully, the way you learn to do when panic was a luxury you couldn't afford. Judge Reeves leaned so far forward over the bench that his robe bunched at the collar. "Doctor, stop immediately," he said. His voice was hard as stone. "This court will not allow unauthorized medical interference." I looked up at him once. Felix's breathing was getting worse by the second, faster, shallower, each exhale a little more labored than the last. "If I stop now," I said calmly, "he might not make it to the ambulance." The judge stiffened like I had struck him. "That is not your decision to make." The courtroom went completely quiet. I could hear the wall clock ticking behind the bench. I could hear Felix's ragged breath beneath my hands. I could feel the weight of every eye in that room pressing down on me from all sides. I held the judge's gaze for just a moment. "Your Honor," I said softly, "I've made harder decisions than this one." Then I turned back to Felix and kept working. I had been in worse places than a silent courtroom. I had worked in the dark, in the dust, under open sky with nothing around me but noise and fire and the sound of men calling for help. A judge's stare was not going to stop my hands. I moved quickly. My hands went to work the way they always did under pressure, without hesitation, without wasted motion, reading the situation through touch and instinct as much as through training. I applied pressure. I checked his airway. I tilted his head just slightly to ease his breathing and watched his chest for the response. It steadied, just barely, but enough. The bailiff had stopped walking. He was standing a few feet away, arms at his sides, watching me with an expression I had seen before. It was the look people got when something didn't match what they expected. He had expected a frightened civilian backing down under a judge's order. What he saw instead was someone completely at ease in the middle of a crisis. Judge Reeves had gone quiet too. I noticed that in my peripheral vision, the way his irritation had shifted into something more like confusion. My hands weren't shaking. My voice wasn't rising. I wasn't asking for permission or looking around for someone to tell me what to do next. Because I already knew. I had practiced these same movements in conditions far harder than this. In sand and heat. In narrow corridors with no light. In moments where the margin between a person living and not living was measured in seconds, not minutes. This wasn't a hospital. He was right about that, but my training had never been limited to hospitals. I pressed a folded gauze pad firmly against Felix's side and kept my eyes on his face, reading every small change, tracking every breath. That was when the prosecutor stood up. His name was Andrew Briggs, and I had noticed him earlier, a sharp-faced man in a dark suit who had spent the morning watching the defense table with the focused expression of someone who had already decided how this day was going to go. He pushed back his chair and straightened his jacket. "Your Honor," he said loudly, his voice cutting across the room, "this woman is interfering with a federal hearing. I'm requesting she be removed from these proceedings immediately." Several people in the gallery shifted in their seats. Patrick was on his feet before Briggs had even finished speaking. "Objection," he said quickly. "My client is having a medical emergency. Removing the only qualified medical professional in this room could cost him his life." Judge Reeves raised a hand for silence. He looked at Felix. He looked at me. Then he looked back at Briggs with the expression of a man who was trying very hard to maintain control of a situation that had already started to slip. "The integrity of these proceedings," the judge began, "means nothing if the defendant dies on your floor," Patrick said. It was the wrong thing to say to a man like Carlton Reeves, and I could see from the way the judge's jaw tightened that Patrick knew it too. But the judge said nothing more. He settled back into his chair with a long, slow exhale through his nose, then muttered, almost to himself, the words that seemed to be the only ones he had left, "Still doesn't make this a hospital." Felix's fingers found my sleeve. The grip was weak, barely more than a brush of fingertips against fabric, but I felt it immediately and looked down at him. His eyes were open. Glassy and struggling, but open. "You came," he said. His voice was barely a whisper, rough and broken at the edges like something that had been held together with tape for too long. I kept my hand steady on his wound and leaned slightly closer. "I told you I would," I said quietly. He swallowed with great effort, like even that small movement cost him something precious. "Just like Cobble," he whispered. I felt my breath catch for just a half second, and I forced it back down before anyone could notice. I stayed focused on his face, on his breathing, on the work in front of me. But I heard the shift in the room. A man sitting near the aisle in the gallery leaned toward the person beside him. A woman near the back row frowned. 3 men in the third row, all sitting with the particular upright stillness of people who had spent years being trained to sit that way, turned to look at each other. One of them mouthed the word. "Cobble." Patrick heard it too. I could tell because he glanced at me with a question forming on his face, the same question everyone else in that courtroom was beginning to hold. What did a small-town emergency doctor have to do with Cobble? I didn't answer. I kept working. I had to lean forward to adjust Felix's position slightly, just enough to keep his airway clear and reduce the pressure on the injury. It was a small movement, but it was enough. The lanyard shifted at my collar. I felt the ribbon slide free before I could stop it, and the small metal disc hanging from it swung out into the fluorescent light for just a moment, silver and deliberate against the pale blue of my shirt. The bailiff noticed first. His gaze dropped to it and stayed there. His expression changed in a way that was slow and quiet, like a man working out a difficult sum in his head. He took one small step forward without seeming to realize he had moved. Judge Reeves followed the man's eyes. He squinted down at me from the bench, brow creased. "Is that a military medal?" I didn't answer. My hands were occupied and Felix needed my full attention. The judge's voice sharpened. "Are you trying to pass yourself off as a veteran as well?" The words "as well" carried their full weight. He meant them as an accusation, the same way he had looked at Felix all morning, like service itself was something that required proof and permission to claim. I felt something move through me, not anger. Something quieter than anger. But I pushed it down the way I always did. I had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do in a critical moment was let your feelings into the room. So I kept my eyes on Felix and kept working. The courtroom clerk appeared at the judge's bench so quickly and so quietly that I almost didn't notice him. He was a young man, early 30s, with careful eyes that suggested he paid close attention to things. He had been watching me since the medal slipped into view. I had caught him staring twice, though I had given no sign of it. Now he was leaning close to Judge Reeves, holding a phone with both hands, his face tight with something between urgency and discomfort. "Sir," he said in a low voice that still carried to the first few rows. "Washington is on the line." The judge barely looked up. "This is not the time," he said flatly. "I understand, Your Honor." The clerk hesitated, then leaned closer still and dropped his voice further. "But I think you should take it." Something about the way he said it, the careful steadiness of it, the way it conveyed urgency while appearing entirely calm, made the judge pause. He looked at the phone. Then back at me. Then at the phone again. The clerk whispered one more thing. "Just a title. Just 2 words." The judge's expression changed completely. It was the kind of change you only saw in a person who had just understood that the ground beneath them was not as solid as they believed. A small stillness crossed his face. A flicker behind the eyes. The posture of a man recalibrating without wanting anyone to notice he was doing it. He took the phone slowly, as if the act itself required more care than usual, and pressed it to his ear. "This is Judge Reeves," he said. The courtroom held its breath. The judge's voice was careful when he answered. Measured. He had the practiced tone of a man who had spent decades controlling rooms through the sound of his own words. But the voice on the other end of that phone was not coming from inside his room. "Is Dr. Petra Walsh present in your courtroom?" Judge Reeves looked at me. I was still kneeling on the floor beside Felix, applying pressure, monitoring his breathing. I had not moved. I had not looked up. But I heard my own name in the judge's expression even before he opened his mouth. "Yes," he said slowly, "she is." The voice on the phone replied without any change in tone. Calm. Unhurried. The calmness of a person who had nothing left to prove and no reason to raise their voice. "Then I suggest you let her finish what she's doing." The judge blinked. It was a single, involuntary blink, the kind that happened when something landed harder than expected. He pulled the phone slightly from his ear and stared at it for a brief moment, as if confirming he had heard correctly. Then he put it back. In the gallery, the room had begun to shift. Not dramatically, no one was standing or speaking out of turn. But I could feel it the way you felt a change in pressure before a storm. Something was tilting. Something that had been decided was beginning to come undone. The bailiff took one quiet step backward. He did not move toward me again. The judge stayed on that call longer than I expected. I could not hear the full conversation from where I knelt, but I could read the silences. They stretched in a way that told me he was not speaking much, only listening. The kind of listening a man did when he no longer had anything useful to add. Then came the question I heard clearly. "Judge Reeves. Do you know who she is?" He glanced at me, and this time something was different in his eyes. Not irritation. Not authority. Something closer to doubt. "A civilian doctor," he said carefully, interfering with my court. The pause that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable. Then the voice answered. Quietly. Without drama or decoration. "She is the combat medic who pulled 3 platoons out of a collapsing building during the Kabul evacuation." The words fell into the room the way heavy things fell, without warning and without apology. Several people in the gallery heard it clearly. I knew because the quality of the silence changed immediately. It became the kind of silence that had weight. I did not look up. I kept my hands where they were and focused on Felix's breathing, which had eased slightly in the last few minutes. His color was still poor, but the worst of the crisis was holding. He was still here. The judge lowered the phone very slowly. He looked at the back of my head for a long moment, as though seeing a completely different person than the one he had addressed an hour ago. He said nothing at all. Patrick Crane was the first to speak. He had been standing beside the defense table throughout the entire call, arms slightly at his sides, watching the judge with the particular stillness of a man absorbing information in real time. When the judge set the phone down, Patrick turned to look at me. He waited until I glanced up briefly. "You served overseas?" he asked. I returned my attention to Felix before answering. "I used to," I said. That was all I said. But 2 words in a silent courtroom carried further than a speech. I heard the ripple of them move through the gallery, quiet murmurs, exchanged looks, the soft shift of bodies in wooden seats. Patrick looked like he had 100 follow-up questions and enough sense not to ask them right now. The 3 veterans in the 3rd row, the ones who had reacted to the word Kabul, were no longer sitting back. They were leaning forward. One of them, an older man with a close-cut beard and the kind of hands that had done difficult work for many years, had his elbows on his knees and his eyes fixed on me with an expression I recognized instantly. It was the expression of someone running through a memory. Trying to match a face to a name. Or a name to a story they had heard in a different place, under very different circumstances. I focused on Felix's pulse beneath my fingers and kept my face calm. I had learned long ago that the past had a way of arriving without knocking, and that the only useful thing to do when it showed up was to keep your hands busy. Felix's hand found mine again. His grip was a little stronger than before, not much, but enough to tell me that what I had done in the last several minutes had mattered. His breathing had steadied into something closer to normal. Not good, but survivable. The kind of condition where time and proper care became possible. He turned his head slightly toward me. "She pulled us out," he whispered. His voice was rough and uneven, the words coming between shallow breaths like he was pushing them up from somewhere very deep. "When the building came down." He paused, swallowed, tried again. 3 of us were buried under the rubble. I kept my voice low. "Felix. Don't try to talk right now." But he wasn't talking to me. He was talking to the room. His eyes drifted toward the gallery, toward the judge, toward anyone who was listening. And in that courtroom, everyone was listening. Every single person had gone completely still. "She went back in twice," he said. "For the others." His voice cracked on the last word, and he closed his eyes. I pressed the back of my hand briefly to his forehead, a habit more than a medical necessity. The kind of touch that said I'm still here. Judge Reeves had both hands flat on the bench. His face had changed in a way that courtroom lighting couldn't hide. The certainty that had filled his expression all morning was gone. In its place was something slower and far less comfortable. The first real signs of understanding. The courtroom doors opened with a sound that changed the room. Not dramatic, no crash, no announcement. Just the heavy, purposeful swing of wide doors held open by 2 security officers who then stepped quietly aside. The kind of space that was made for someone who did not need to ask for it. The defense secretary walked in. I did not see him enter. I was still kneeling beside Felix, still focused on his breathing, still doing the job I had come here to do. But I felt the room change in a way that was unmistakable, a collective intake of breath, a sudden and complete stillness, the sound of chairs shifting as everyone around me rose to their feet. Everyone except me. I stayed where I was. My hands were occupied, and Felix's life was more important than protocol. I heard the footsteps moving down the center aisle, measured and deliberate, the kind of steps that belonged to a person who was never in a hurry because they never needed to be. They slowed as they reached the front of the room. Then they stopped just behind me. I could feel the presence before I turned, the weight of attention converging on a single point, the deep hush that meant something significant had arrived and the room understood it. Secretary Victor Hayes stood a few feet away. He did not look at the bench. He did not look at the gallery. He looked at Felix first, just for a moment, taking in what he saw with quiet, practiced eyes, and then he looked at me. The secretary crouched down. Not a symbolic gesture. Not the polished posture of someone performing concern for a watching room. He actually lowered himself to the floor beside the defense table, dress uniform and all, and looked at Felix with the expression of a man who understood exactly what he was seeing. Then he turned to me. His voice was quiet enough that only the people closest to us could hear it clearly. "Dr. Walsh," he said. He paused for the span of a single breath. Or should I say, Raven 6. The room went silent in a way that was different from all the silences before it. This one had depth. I stayed very still. The call sign arrived like something from another world, a world of dust and heat and radio chatter and decisions that never fully left you, no matter how many years of hospital corridors you tried to put between yourself and that place. I had not heard those two words spoken out loud in a very long time. I had not expected to hear them here. I felt something shift inside me, old and heavy, like a door moving on a hinge that had not been touched in years. I let it move. I did not let it open. I looked at the secretary steadily. "Mr. Secretary," I said. That was all. He held my gaze for a moment with something in his expression that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, something that sat between the two, the way most true things did. Then he stood and turned to face the bench. Secretary Hayes did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The room was quiet enough that every word traveled without effort, landing evenly across the gallery, the bench, and the defense table behind me. "Your Honor," he said, "I want to explain to this court exactly what it is looking at." Judge Reeves said nothing. His hands were flat on the bench. During the Kabul evacuation, a secondary collapse occurred at a building where 12 soldiers were sheltering while waiting for extraction. The blast brought down the eastern wall and buried 3 men under approximately 2 meters of debris. He paused for a moment. The combat medic assigned to that unit, call sign Raven 6, was 40 meters away when the collapse happened. She had already treated 4 casualties that day and had not slept in over 30 hours. He glanced at me once. I was still kneeling beside Felix, listening without looking up. She went into that rubble twice to pull men out. The 3rd man she reached was buried the deepest. She remained under active fire until extraction was complete. She refused to be evacuated until all 3 casualties were clear. The secretary folded his hands in front of him. She was injured during the 2nd entry. She did not report it until every man was secured. I kept my eyes on Felix's face. He was listening too, eyes open, quiet, with the particular stillness of someone hearing their own story told aloud by someone else for the very first time. "I was doing my job," I said softly. The judge had not moved. His hands were still on the bench. His robe was still pressed flat across his shoulders. From a distance, he might have looked exactly the same as he had an hour ago, upright, composed, in control. But his face was different. The lines that had hardened into authority all morning had softened into something far less certain. He was looking at me the way people looked at things after they finally understood them, not seeing something new, but seeing clearly what had always been there. The woman he had pointed at. The woman he had told to leave. The woman he had dismissed with a scoff before she had finished her first sentence. She had been kneeling on the floor of his courtroom the entire time, keeping a man alive with her bare hands and 11 years of hard-earned training, while he interrogated her medical bag. I did not look at him. I wasn't looking for his recognition. I had not come here for anything that had my name on it. But I understood what he was processing. I had seen that expression before on the faces of men who had spoken too quickly and then been asked to sit quietly with what they said. It was not a comfortable place to be, and I had no desire to make it worse. What mattered was the man on the floor beside me. What mattered was that Felix, who had served, who had struggled, who had called me because he had no one else, was still breathing. Everything else was noise. Patrick had been waiting for the right moment, and he found it now. He straightened his jacket, picked up a folder from the defense table, and approached the bench with the measured steps of a man who had done this many times before and knew exactly how long patience needed to last before it became useful. "Your Honor," he said, "with the court's permission, I'd like to introduce evidence relevant to the charges against my client." The judge gave a slow nod. Patrick opened the folder. "The prosecution has framed this case as random violence. My client allegedly struck a man named Gerald Voss outside a residential building 6 weeks ago." He paused. What the initial report did not include, and what these documents confirm, is that Voss was running an illegal lending operation targeting recently discharged veterans. He was charging interest rates of over 300%, making threats against families, and in at least 2 documented cases, using physical intimidation when payments were missed. He placed the papers on the clerk's desk. Felix Adamu did not attack Gerald Voss out of aggression. He intervened to stop Voss from assaulting a 60-year-old retired serviceman who owed him money. The courtroom stirred. Several veterans in the gallery exchanged heavy looks. The prosecutor, Andrew Briggs, was very still. "That is why Dr. Walsh came today," Patrick continued. "Not to perform medicine in your courtroom, Your Honor. To testify that Felix Adamu is not a violent man." He closed the folder. "He is a protective one." Judge Reeves called a recess. He said it quietly, without the sharp crack of the gavel he had used all morning. Just the 2 words, "short recess," and then he stood and walked through the door behind the bench without looking at anyone. The bailiff relayed the order to the room. Within minutes, paramedics arrived through the side entrance with a stretcher, moving quickly and efficiently the way trained people always did. I stepped back and let them work. I answered their questions in clear sentences: injury location, estimated blood loss, the interventions I had applied, and watched them stabilize Felix with the same focused calm I had used. Before they lifted him onto the stretcher, he reached out and caught my wrist. His grip was stronger now than it had been since he collapsed. "You saved me twice," he said. His voice was clearer. His eyes were steady. I shook my head slightly. "You saved yourself both times," I told him. "You held on." He almost smiled at that, a tired, genuine almost smile that was better than anything else that had happened in that room all day. "Tell them the truth," I said quietly. "Just like you told me." He nodded once. As the paramedics wheeled him toward the door, the courtroom was quieter than it had been at any point that morning. Not the rigid, pressured quiet of authority being asserted. Something else entirely. The kind of quiet that came after something had shifted, when people were still sitting with what it meant and weren't quite sure yet how to hold it. I stood up slowly and stretched my hands. When proceedings resumed, the judge took longer to settle than usual. He set his papers down. He adjusted his glasses. He looked out across the courtroom, at the gallery, at the defense table where Patrick stood alone, at the empty space on the floor where Felix had been lying, and then he looked at me. I was sitting in the second row of the gallery, my medical bag on the floor at my feet, hands folded quietly in my lap. Judge Carlton Reeves cleared his throat. "Dr. Walsh," he said. His voice was different from what it had been that morning. The edges had gone out of it. What remained was plainer. More honest. "This court acknowledges that an error in judgment occurred today." He paused and continued, each word placed with deliberate care. The remarks directed at you were inappropriate and unwarranted. I offer an unreserved apology. The gallery was completely still. I inclined my head once. Thank you, Your Honor, I said. He held my gaze for a moment before looking back at his papers. Then he looked up again. Is there anything you would like to say to this court before I address the matter of the charges? I thought about everything I could say, about how quickly assumptions were made, about how loudly authority could speak and how little it sometimes understood. I thought about all of it, and then I set it aside. Just hear Felix's case fairly, I said. I looked at the judge steadily. That's all I came for. The charges were dismissed pending full investigation. Judge Reeves recommended that the case be reviewed through a veteran advocacy panel rather than standard prosecution. He cited the new evidence, the context of Felix's actions, and the absence of any prior record. The prosecutor, Andrew Briggs, did not object. After the hearing ended, Secretary Hayes found me in the corridor outside the courtroom. He offered a formal recognition ceremony, the kind with photographs, speeches, and the specific weight of official acknowledgement. He said the things that people in his position said well, and he meant every one of them. I thanked him and declined. There are patients waiting at my clinic, I said. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him turning that answer over, examining it, trying to decide if it was humility or simply the truth. It was simply the truth. Raven 6, he said quietly, almost to himself. That name belongs to a different time, I told him. I'm just Petra now. He nodded slowly, like he understood, even if he didn't fully agree. I walked out of the courthouse and into the rain. It was soft and steady, the kind that didn't try to announce itself. I stood on the steps for a moment and let it settle on my shoulders. Behind me, through the heavy doors, I could hear the building returning to its ordinary rhythms, voices, footsteps, the distant sound of the next case being called. I picked up my medical bag. I walked to my car. And if this story reminded you that the bravest people in the room are often the quietest ones, that Real Service doesn't wear a sign and doesn't ask to be seen, then subscribe and stay with us, because the world is full of people like Petra Walsh, and every single one of their stories deserves to be told.